Hi, everyone. Welcome to our second session. We are going to be doing the session of how to measure, track, and report your impact. I'd like to welcome Michael. Michael manages the town of Halton Hills Energy and Climate Change, and Denise Aragon, who leads the community climate change mitigation work at the town of Oakville. Welcome.
Okay, hey everybody. Okay, so this is kind of very, very key concepts to get because you're going to have to actually apply these when you put your program into action that you're going to be doing after you come out of this workshop. So pay very close attention. We got a lot to cover. We're going to have to cover it kind of fast, but hopefully it'll be clear by the end. So the goal of this workshop is to figure out how are you going to calculate GHG emissions and how are you going to calculate the impact of a GHG emission reduction program. So how do you do that? This, if you remember one thing from this workshop, this is the thing to remember, okay? GHG emissions equal a particular activity times the energy intensity of that activity times the emission factor of that energy, okay? What does that mean? What that means is, so what's an activity? Okay, so an activity is some quantity of a greenhouse gas emission producing behavior. Some activity that produces or that consumes fuel or energy or produces greenhouse gas emissions, right? So examples could be driving a certain distance, using a light bulb for a particular amount of time, eating a certain quantity of food, right? So that's an activity. Something to keep in mind as you design your program is that some activities are going to be easier to quantify than others, right? If you're calculating the amount of emissions produced by a certain distance traveled in a car, you can figure out pretty easily how far you've traveled in your car, right? If you're trying to figure out, there are a number of different activities that you might think about doing where it's not going to be so easy to figure out exactly how much of that thing you're doing. So keep in mind, how are you going to quantify your activity that you've decided to do before you move forward with your program? So the next step in this calculation, energy intensity. So what's energy intensity? Energy intensity is the amount of energy or fuel used during a particular quantity of an activity, right? So you can think of this in terms of common examples like the number of liters of gasoline per kilometer that you drive in a car, or the number of kilowatt hours an electrical appliance uses for a certain duration that it's running for, right? So that's the energy intensity. Other ones like cubic meter per hour, gigajoule per meter squared. These are common ones that you might encounter, but essentially you're just thinking about, if I do this for a certain amount of time, how much energy or fuel am I going to consume while doing it, right? You need to know that. The next thing you need to know is, what is an emission factor? So an emission factor is the quantity of greenhouse gas emissions produced by using 1 unit of whatever energy or fuel you're consuming in your activity, right? So, for example, 1 kilowatt hour of electricity in Ontario produces on average 20 grams of CO2. 1 cubic meter of natural gas, like what you use to heat your home, for example, produces 1,899 grams of CO2 per cubic meter. So these are things you want to figure out. You need to know how much carbon emissions are produced by consuming whatever unit of fuel you're dealing with in your program. So once you have those things, you can calculate quantity of the activity that you've done, the energy intensity of that activity, how much fuel or energy does it use, and then the emission factor, which is how much GHG is produced by using that volume of fuel. Once you have those three things, you can figure out your greenhouse gas emissions. And that's all you really need to know to get a volume of emissions. So let's look at some examples. Turning on 10 lights for 100 hours, they use 0.05 kilowatts per hour per light. They produce 20 grams of CO2 per kilowatt hour. At the end of this, you're going to have 1 gram of CO2. On the other Other examples, you could drive a car for 100 kilometers. It uses 0.09 liters of gas per kilometer that you travel. That produces 2,317 grams of CO2 per liter of fuel burned. That's going to produce 208 kilograms of CO2. Another example, heating a standard house for an entire year uses about 16 cubic meters of natural gas per cubic meter or per square meter of floor space, and you're going to end up with 5,000 kilograms of CO2 over that period. So that's how you want to think through, do I know how much of the activity I'm doing? Do I know how much fuel it uses? And do I know how much emissions that amount of fuel produces? Simple enough, right? There's another version of this that you might encounter in some of the programs that you might be thinking about doing, and this is what we would commonly call consumption-based activities. So you might be thinking about, like, what you want to do is you're going to consume less meat, for example, over the period of the program. We all know that, for example, beef has a significant carbon impact. We might be thinking about scaling back the amount of beef that we consume over this period. So typically what you're going to be doing here is you're going to be looking at the GHG emissions equals the quantity of whatever thing you're consuming. It could be a volume of, or a weight of food, could be any other product that you consume, times a carbon intensity per unit of that product that you're consuming. Consumption-based activities, I should warn you, have some kind of unique challenges associated with them. This formula looks simpler than the formula that we talked about earlier, but actually this number here hides a lot of complexity, and it can be quite difficult in some cases to find the carbon intensity per unit of whatever thing you're doing. What constitutes a unit of that thing? Like, if you're gonna keep an old sweater instead of buying a new sweater, that sweater has a carbon intensity associated with it, but how are you gonna find that? What constitutes the use of a sweater, right? So you need to think through, okay, how am I gonna think through this carbon intensity? So it can be challenging. You can do it though. We have provided in the workbook that you've all been provided, there are some kind of standard emissions quantities associated with quantities of various common foods. So that's probably a simpler one to do if you're thinking about doing that. But if you start to get into certain types of products, it can be quite complex. So just think that through before you decide to do that as your program. So returning to this calculation, remember, GHG emissions equals an activity times an energy intensity times an emission factor. Now, I'll turn it over to my colleague.
Hello, everyone. Okay. I think we're fairly good time-wise. I will just put the disclaimer out here. We're going to try and go pretty fast because we want extra time for the activity in the workbooks. Our activity is really just going to take you through the whole process that we're describing here. So that's a great time to ask questions and get a little bit more into this. Michael's done a great job of showing you how to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. Now I am going to take you through how to calculate your impact. So impact is really three simple things. It's establishing a greenhouse gas emissions baseline, measuring the greenhouse gas emissions of your program, your commitment, what you've decided to change, and then figuring out and determining the difference between the two. So it's baseline minus scenario equals impact. And hopefully that's a positive number, and that number describes your greenhouse gas emissions saved. So what is a baseline? Is this a term that people are comfortable with? This really just means, what are the greenhouse gas emissions that you produce before you actually start your program, before you actually make a change? So if I'm like a big coffee drinker and I want to cut down on my coffee, my baseline would be drinking 2 cups of coffee a day. So this is before you actually start your change. They're large coffees. Your scenario is the greenhouse gas emissions that you produce when you're actually doing your commitment. Now, there could be two different points that you measure this. You can measure it before you actually start your commitment or program to see theoretically what greenhouse gas emissions you would save, and then check afterwards to see what the actual was, just to see and just to check in with yourself. Was this an easy program? Was it a tough program? What were some of the barriers there? Ultimately, these programs, what we want for you is to use them as learning experiences. So we know that there's going to be bumps and hiccups along the way. And it's great to be really honest and capture all of those as well. So going back, just a reflash of how you're going to actually calculate your greenhouse gas emissions, it's these three pieces. Now, when you're picking your program, it's really about using these three pieces as levers and changing one of each or more than one of each. So for any specific activity, we'll go back to these examples, you might want to lessen or change the amount that you're doing the activity. So if it's driving, for instance, maybe you're going to drive less. You're going to reduce the amount of kilometers that you're doing that activity. For the example for the light bulbs, maybe you're changing the energy intensity of the light bulbs. So instead of using a 60-watt light bulb, you're going to be using a LED light bulb that uses a lot of less energy, but you're going to keep your light bulbs on for the same amount of time each between your baseline and from your program. Or it could be the actual carbon intensity. And this was kind of came up earlier and when people were asking questions to the panelists. So carbon intensity could be you're doing the same amount of activity with the same energy intensity, but you've switched the type of fuel that you're using, and there's less carbon intensity. That fuel, that energy source actually creates less greenhouse gas emissions. Playing with those three things is going to impact the greenhouse gas results that you get in the end. And again, one or more can be changed. So you can put in LEDs and you can keep them on for a shorter period of time as well. So in all of this, you're going to have to be tracking and measuring. So both for the baseline as well as for your program and scenario. What's good thing to keep in mind is that the way that you measure and track your baseline matches your program. So if you're going to commit to a program that's a year long, let's say, but then you measure your baseline for a day, does that really match up? No. And if your program is to reduce the amount of heating that you use in your house, let's say, does it make sense to measure that for one day? Probably not, because it could be a really cold day, it could be a warm day, and that's going to impact what your baseline is, and it's going to throw off ultimately your impact. What would be good to do if your program is a year but you can't measure your baseline for a year, make sure that it is still an appropriate length. Maybe it's a month. Maybe it's, if your program's a month, maybe your baseline is a week, and then you can sort of multiply that out. But it's really important when you make those assumptions or you have to fill in those gaps that you're really clear about that when you're writing up your final results. So you might even come up with pieces where you didn't track everything that you needed to, and you have to fill in those gaps as well. Just be really transparent about that. Write all of that down. Be really clear about what data you need to get. So I would sit down with your workbooks, with your equation, and start with that so that you're making sure that you're tracking the right data that's really relevant to your program. So if you're looking at home heating, do you need to measure how long your lights are on? No, you don't, because that data isn't relevant to your calculation. I sort of talked about this too, but as you're tracking, you might find yourself having incomplete data. You might have missed calculating or missed tracking for a day. That's okay, that happens. You might need to make assumptions around those numbers. Again, just be really clear about what those assumptions are. And if you need to reference any emissions factor or any energy intensity, again, really link it to where did you get that information? Is it a credible source? So that when we're all looking and compiling our results, that we know that they're very valid. Okay, so again, our favorite equation here. Just one last time. It's in your workbook, but this is really essential. And we're going to do an activity around this equation right now. But just to go back to this, once you've figured out your greenhouse gas emissions, you're going to take it through your baseline, then your program, and it's your intended program, and then your actual, what were you able to achieve, and then figure out your impact. And that's really just program or baseline minus program. Okay, so we have an exercise for you. Now, we're going to ask you to all huddle around tables. You seem to naturally do that. That's great. We have 2 copies at each table, but we want you to work together on doing these activities. Maybe you need to divide the tables by half. We're going to read out the scenario for you and just highlight a few things. And we've gone through and put in some of the numbers, but what's really key there is just to fill in the blanks with the information you have. You will need your workbook packages that you're getting from the conference because there's some important numbers that we want you to reference. And we want you to start practicing how to use the information in there. So it'll be under this workshop's name. Okay, so the workshop, the exercise is, what a year. You got your license and you have full access to use a 2008 Ford Edge. You are taking advantage of this situation and you are driving yourself and only yourself to school every day, and then you're driving yourself home at the end of the day. After attending this conference, you decide, I'm going to make a change, I'm going to drive less. And you consider some options. So you consider carpooling. You can't find anybody to carpool with you. You think about walking, and you think that's a good idea. Maybe, it's a 3-kilometer walk to school. Maybe I can try and do that sometimes. You think about biking. Probably not going to work for you in the winter, but something you can think about in the summer. And then you look at the Oakville Transit, because this is in Oakville. You look at the Oakville Transit website and you find that there's a bus that goes basically from your house and takes you directly to school, and the same, it goes to school and takes you directly home at the end of the day. So you start your commitment at the beginning of January, and you start tracking things like how many people are on the bus, how many days you were actually able to take the bus, what days you decided to walk, if you needed to drive on certain days. And that is in your packages. It's on a calendar at the back. Okay? And there is some more research that you do that's in your packages as well that will help you go through the answer sheets. Now, Michael wanted to we've just gone through this exercise with another group, so we have some lessons learned on what might trip you up. So Michael's just going to go through that now.
Yeah, so as you work through the calculations that you need to do to complete this exercise, I think you put in some of the distances traveled. Okay, so one of the things to pay attention to is that you're not double calculating some of the data that's in there. So for example, it will ask you to calculate the distance per trip and then multiply that at some point by the total number of trips. What people in the last exercise, some of them were doing was taking the total number of trips or the total number of kilometers traveled in all the trips and then multiplying that by the number of trips. And the result is, much, much higher than it should ultimately be. So just make sure that you're not double counting or confusing units. So just pay attention to each step as you go along the way.
We will be here.
We'll float around while you're doing the exercise. Answer any questions, just put your hand up and we'll check in. So just, work together, work through all the data that you're going to need. The ultimate answer that you get is less important than thinking through the process of calculating it and understand how you're going to ultimately do that when you do your program. So just, see how far you get and think through the logic of it, and we'll see where we end up, okay? All right, so you have 20 minutes to complete the exercise. Hopefully we'll get it done a little bit beforehand and we can possibly have some questions or work through what answers people end up with, okay? Everybody know what they're supposed to be doing? Great, okay.